Okay, welcome everyone. This is the third session of Cultural Schooling Project Talk series. Today we have Dr. Kimberly Rios. She's our guest today. And she's an associate professor at Ohio University. She's also a grantee in the Cultural Schooling Project. Dr. Rios authored a large number of journal publications, book chapters on topics like identity, intergroup relationships, religious affiliation, among many, many other topics. Today, Dr. Rios will present perceptions of science-religion compatibility in the US and the UAE. Please unmute and welcome Dr. Rios.
All right, I am sharing my screen here. Can you all see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. So just give me a second to start the slideshow, make sure everything's functioning properly. But thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited to share my work with you today that I've conducted in collaboration with Mark Aveyard on perceptions of the science-religion relationship in the US and in the UAE. So first, a little bit about Dr. Aveyard and myself. I'm a professor of psychology at Ohio University. I was trained as a social psychologist, and my research had interests that are related specifically to this project, center on stereotypes about religion and science, as well as more generally intergroup relations. And my work has been funded, in addition to by the Cultural Schooling Project, the John Templeton Foundation, and along with Dr. Aveyard, a grant from the Global Research Religion Research Initiative. Dr. Mark Aveyard is an associate professor of psychology at American University of Sharjah in the UAE. And he was trained as a cognitive psychologist, but does a lot of social psych work as well, and has general interests in religion and culture, as well as in embodied cognition. And his work as well has been funded through the Global Religion Research Initiative project and the Culture of Schooling with me. So to start us off, and to give you a little bit of context about how religion and science, specifically their relationship, is often viewed in Western societies, you can see in these cartoons and memes that it's depicted as a relationship that's often in conflict. That religion and science are perceived as two schools of thought that either go in opposite directions or are outright considered oxymorons, as in the cartoon with the Christian Science doctor who tells the patient with no arms that all they have to do is pray and I guess they'll grow a new set of arms. So this is how religion and science are often depicted in popular culture, at least in this particular context within the US. And indeed, if we look at the statistics on the percentage of scientists in the US that are religious, they generally pale in comparison to the percentage of religious people within the general US population. So just to give you a couple of statistics on this point, in 2016, Elaine Eklund and her colleagues published a study that showed 39% of scientists at universities and research institutions in the US, and these were biologists and physicists, identified with some sort of religious affiliation. And this is in comparison to roughly 70% by the latest count of the Pew Research Institution. So this is quite a discrepancy. And it's especially Christians who are underrepresented in the sciences relative to their proportions in the US population. In fact, the only religious group that tends to be overrepresented in the sciences relative to their numbers within the US is Jewish people. But Christians, given their status as the majority religious group in the US and the fact that many of the conflict narratives we hear about religion and scientists pertain to Christians, that group will be the focus of my talk today, along with Muslims in the UAE. Another statistic that is particularly compelling, but that is over 20 years old now, is that only 7% of members of the National Academy of Sciences, which is a very elite organization in the US, report believing in God. And given the growing secularization in American society, this percentage is likely even lower today. And this is in comparison to about 80% of the general US population as of 2016 who says they believe in God. So as I mentioned, in Western societies, there is this perception and scientific evidence of a perception that many people have about a conflict between religion and science. Now, my talk today is not going to focus on whether religion actually can coexist with science. This is a terrible joke, but I make it every time. I am agnostic on this topic, and I will focus on perceptions of conflict. So in one of the first demonstrations of this perceived conflict, Preston and Epley showed that people, even on an automatic level, think of scientific and religious explanations for major events to be incompatible. For example, in one study, they gave college student participants either a strong scientific explanation for an event like a natural disaster or a weak scientific explanation. And those who got the strong scientific explanation subsequently reported less automatic or lower automatic positive feelings toward God. And those who got the weak scientific explanation reported more positive automatic feelings toward God. So this suggests science and God concepts are seen as in tension, even on an implicit level for many people in North America. Similarly, even reading about scientists who are religious versus non-religious can alter people's perceptions of the science-religion relationship. So take two examples who are well known in Western societies, Francis Collins and Richard Dawkins. Francis Collins, as of December 2021, is the former director of the National Institutes of Health and is a very outspoken Christian. Richard Dawkins, on the other hand, is an evolutionary biologist based in the UK who is a very strong atheist. Now, participants who were in the general US population who read a passage that was written by or about Francis Collins reported that they saw less conflict between science and religion than if they hadn't read that passage. But on the other hand, reading a passage about Richard Dawkins did not influence participants' perceptions of religion-science conflict. And perhaps that's because the default in American society is, at least sometimes, to see religion and science as conflicting. So Dawkins' position that they do conflict and that science is superior wasn't necessarily a surprise to many of these participants, but Collins's position that you can be religious and a scientist was surprising. So it did alter participants' perceptions. So not only is there a perception of conflict between science and religion as schools of thought within Western societies, but there also seems to be a conflict between scientific and religious identities. And people's identities themselves can influence how they feel about the science-religion relationship. So to take a couple of examples from recent literature, some of my colleagues in the UK have shown that religion-science conflict perceptions tend to be highest among atheist participants and lowest among individuals who are religious. Individuals who report being agnostic or no religion in particular fall somewhere in the middle. So it's interestingly atheist people who tend to say, yeah, religion and science cannot go together, and counter to many people's stereotypes, it's religious people who say they can go together. Similarly, my colleague Carissa Sharp, who's actually here in the audience, so I wanted to give her a little shout out, led a paper that I was on as well, showing that religious scientists are seen as somewhat counter-stereotypical relative to non-religious scientists. So people see, in other words, a scientist who's religious as more surprising than a scientist who is not religious. And this is especially true for people who are themselves non-religious. Religious people don't particularly see religious scientists as surprising, but non-religious people do. And finally, in some of my own research, I found that Christians in the US tend to be stereotyped as less competent and less trusting in science than other religious groups and other non-religious groups, even though Christians themselves don't endorse these stereotypes. Nevertheless, they know these stereotypes are out there and that other people buy into them. But let's take a look at how religious scientists are represented within predominantly Muslim countries, as well as how the religion-science relationship is represented in these contexts. And here the picture looks very different from in the US and in many other Western societies. So I cited a statistic earlier that 39% of scientists identify with some sort of religious affiliation in the US. This percentage is 84% among scientists, so biologists and physicists at universities and research institutes in Turkey, which is primarily Muslim. And as another statistic, even though a third of scientists in Turkey think that religion and science can coexist, this proportion is only 12% in the US. So there tends to be more of an, or at least less of a narrative of religion and science conflict in Muslim countries, or at least in Turkey, than in the US. And here we can take a look at how this is represented in Islam as a whole and in primarily Muslim countries. So across a Pew Research Center study or a poll of individuals in 23 predominantly Muslim countries across 3 different continents, most Muslims perceived there to be no conflict between science and religion when asked. There were a couple of exceptions where more people said that there was a conflict versus there was not, but the only 2 countries that were the exception were Albania and Lebanon. In every other country, the percentage of people who said there was no conflict exceeded that who said there was a conflict. And even within the US, Muslim scientists tend to see the conflict between science and religion, or the perceived conflict, as an issue that's specific to Christianity, at least the way that it's talked about in the media and among the general public. As another piece of evidence that perceptions of the religion-science relationship can vary cross-culturally, McFeeters and colleagues have recently shown that whereas being religious predicts overall more negative attitudes towards science in the US, this relationship does not hold in non-Western countries. It's only apparent in Western societies. So with this background in mind, my colleague and I had a couple of different research questions for which I'm going to present evidence today. First of all, we know that there's differences in conflict and compatibility perceptions of science and religion across sociocultural contexts. But what might predict these differences in the first place? And in the first study I'll show you that we published in 2019, we looked at the role of exposure to other cultural contexts among our participants. Second, we wanted to look at specifically religious and scientific identities and how they relate to one another across cultural contexts, with the idea being that in countries like the US, where there's a predominant conflict narrative, we might find more of a negative correlation between identifying as religious and identifying as a scientist or with science than in other societies. Finally, in a cross-cultural experiment, we sought to test whether perceptions of religion-science compatibility can be experimentally manipulated to better establish causality, and to see what effects that might have on religious individuals' identification with science and belonging in science across cultures. So to give you a little bit more information about the 2 research sites on which I'm focusing today, Ohio University, which is my institution, is located in rural southeastern Ohio in the foothills of Appalachia. And we have about 18,000 undergrads. It's a predominantly white institution with 80% of students identifying as such. Although we have a large first generation population where about a quarter to a third of students are the first in their family to attend college. And roughly 60% of our students identify at least nominally with some sort of Christian religion. And being in rural southeastern Ohio, Athens County, which is the site of our institution, is among the lowest SES counties in the state of Ohio. So we have a lot of socioeconomic diversity. American University of Sharjah is located about 30 kilometers from Dubai in the city of Sharjah in the UAE. And it's a private institution that's US accredited, although it was founded and is based entirely in the UAE. And the official language of instruction is English, although most students do speak Arabic as a native language. There are about 5,000 undergrads at the institution, and they represent a mix of different cultural backgrounds, most of whom come from various Arabic countries within and outside the UAE. And the vast majority of these students identify as Muslim. So in our first study that we conducted together, we wanted once again to look at the role of cross-cultural exposure in predicting college students' perceptions of religion science compatibility. And to do this, we recruited both Muslim undergraduates in the UAE, so at Mark's institution, and Christian undergraduates at OU, my institution. And we asked them, first of all, about the average number of weeks per year they spent in Western countries. So this was for UAE participants. We asked them, how many weeks per year on average do you and your family go to North America, Western Europe, or Australia, New Zealand? And in the US, this question was phrased, how many weeks per year do you spend outside the country, to avoid potential floor effects? Because we assumed, I think rightfully so, that the vast majority of OU students have never been to the Middle East. Our outcome measure was perceptions of religion and science compatibility. And this was a 4-item scale that we developed, where we basically asked participants to what extent they personally believe religion and science are compatible versus incompatible, that it's impossible versus possible to be both a religious person and a scientist, and so forth, where higher scores represent higher compatibility perceptions. We also controlled for participants' pre-existing levels of belief in God with a 5-item scale from Preston and Epley. So what's the general importance of God in your life? How certain are you that God exists? As well as a 13-item measure of scientific knowledge with questions about, for example, the temperature of the Earth, whether the Earth revolves around the sun or the sun revolves around the Earth. Interesting fact, over 25% of Americans as of 2014 incorrectly believe that the sun revolves around the Earth. So take that as you will. So we predicted here that perhaps in a primarily Muslim country like the UAE, students who had been more exposed to Western societies might report higher perceptions of religion and science conflict, or lower perceptions of compatibility. And this is exactly what we found. Within the UAE sample, which is at the top here, the higher number of weeks per year participants spent in the West, the lower their perceptions of religion and science compatibility were. And this was controlling for their belief in God, as well as their knowledge of science, both of which were positively correlated with compatibility perceptions. In the US, on the other hand, exposure to other countries, or at least average number of weeks spent traveling there, was uncorrelated with religion science compatibility beliefs. But belief in God and science knowledge, the covariates, once again, were positively correlated. So this gives us a little bit of insight into how these compatibility perceptions might be malleable across contexts. Now, of course, this isn't evidence for causality. This is a cross-sectional correlational study. So we'll get to the causality bit at the end of the talk. But to summarize briefly, whereas we did find a relationship between Muslim students who saw religion and science as more in conflict the more time they spent in the West, there was once again no relationship in the US. And we believe that this could have possible implications for how much people identify in each of these countries with religion versus with science. And when I talk about identification with religion and science, I'm referring to in social psychological terms, how important or how central is being religious or is science as a whole to your sense of self and your sense of who you are as a person? So we thought in societies where religion and science are perceived as more in conflict, like in the US, that people might see their identification with science and their identification with religion as mutually exclusive and as negatively associated. Whereas this association might not be as pronounced in countries like the UAE, where there is less of a perception of conflict between the two domains. So to test this, Mark and I took some data that we collected as part of a study funded by the Global Religion Research Initiative grant that we got. And we surveyed first year undergraduates from both OU as well as AUS, so in the US and the UAE. And we measured a couple of different things. First of all, we assessed participants' identification with religion using an 8-item scale adapted from originally a measure of racial and ethnic identification, but we rephrased the items to pertain to being religious. For example, being religious is an important part of my self-image. So even though participants in this study were a mix of religious, non-religious, the majority of undergrads at OU reported being Christian, and the majority of undergrads at AUS reported being Muslim. We measured science identification with 2 different scales, which were standardized and averaged together because they were measured using different scale numbers. First of all, we assessed participants' agreement with, or the extent to which they thought 5 different scientifically relevant traits describe them. For example, rational, logical, and analytical. We also asked them to press 1 key on the computer if a particular science concept represented them or felt like me, versus another key if the science concept did not represent them or was not me, with terms like biology, physics, and chemistry used in a previous study. And so we calculated the number of me versus not me responses to these science concepts, and we averaged them together, standardized, with participants' endorsement of whether these 5 science-relevant traits describe themselves. We also measured perceptions of religion and science compatibility, like we did in the previous study with the 4-item scale. And the results here showed that in the UAE, so again, in a country where religion and science are seen as relatively compatible, identification with being religious was not related to identification with science. And perceptions that religion and science were compatible were correlated positively with both religious identification and science identification. So the people who said religion and science can go together were both people who identified as religious and people who identified closely with science, indicating that these participants did see these identities as close together. In the OU sample, on the other hand, identification with being religious actually negatively predicted identification with science. And this was even controlling for whether participants reported liberal versus conservative political views, which are often weakly at least correlated with religiosity. And in this sample, even though people who believed religion and science were compatible tended to be more religious, consistent with previous research, compatibility perceptions were not correlated with identification with science. So this suggests, once again, that people who are invested in science are not necessarily the ones who think of religion and science as compatible, but people who are invested in religion do. So with these 2 studies in mind, having shown a little bit about what predicts perceptions of compatibility and how religious and scientific identification can be related to these perceptions, what we wanted to do next, and for our final study, was to experimentally manipulate perceptions of religion and science compatibility in their relationship across cultures. And we thought this step was particularly important in establishing causality and determining what leads religious people to identify more versus less with science in the first place, given, at least in the US, religious people and Christians in particular's underrepresentation in science. So I have some previous research in my lab that I wanted to briefly share with you about how we can successfully manipulate perceptions of the religion and science relationship within the US. And it turns out that telling participants that religion and science can go together and coexist relative to religion and science being in conflict actually reduces non-Christian stereotypes of Christians as unscientific and intelligent. My student Cameron Mackey took the lead on this article, which is currently in press. And what we did here was we recruited participants of all religious affiliations. These were adults on an online sample. And we gave them what I would have pre-2016 called a fake news article, but that term now has different connotations. So I'll say an ostensibly real news article. And the headline was about either how a major national organization spoke out on the compatibility between religion and science, or Christianity and science, or the conflict between the two, and presented a variety of statistics on the percentage of Americans who thought Christianity and science were compatible versus incompatible, the percentage of university professors who identified as Christian versus not Christian, and who believed in these compatibility perceptions. And we looked, after determining that this manipulation did in fact affect participants' own perceptions of religion science compatibility, which it did, we looked at measures of participants' stereotypes of Christians. So we looked at this on both an explicit level, so participants' ratings of Christians as scientifically competent, scientifically able, and interested in science, as well as a more subtle measure, which has been used in psychology research and is termed the conjunction fallacy. And in this conjunction fallacy, people are given a choice between whether, sorry, there's a little bit of interference outside. There's some wind blowing. Hope you all can still hear me okay, but I'll try to talk through that. So anyway, with the conjunction fallacy paradigm, people are given a description of a person and are asked to indicate what is the most likely descriptor of or role of this person. Is this person more likely to be this or that? So as an example, the original conjunction fallacy study presented participants with a target named Linda, who was really outspoken, attended a lot of social justice movements and protests. And then they asked participants, is Linda more likely to be a bank teller or a bank teller and a feminist? Now, the description of Linda was very consistent with many people's stereotypes of feminists. So a lot of people would say Linda's more likely to be a bank teller and a feminist, even though that's wrong. Probabilistically, Linda's more likely to only be in one of those categories than to be in both, because feminist bank tellers are only a small subset, or well, I don't know about small, but a subset of bank tellers as a whole group. So we did the same thing with a person who was described in a way that was stereotypically intelligent. So this was a person named Kevin, whose SAT scores were through the roof, who liked to play chess and think critically about things. And we asked participants, what's the likelihood that Kevin has a PhD? And also that Kevin has a PhD and is a Christian. And we also asked a separate group of participants about what the likelihood that Kevin was had a PhD and was an atheist, and we didn't find any significant effects on that question. So I'm focusing on the likelihood of Kevin having a PhD and being a Christian. So as our results show, Christian participants overall stereotype their group as more scientifically competent than non-religious people did. And if I divide this up into Christians versus all non-Christians instead, the results look exactly the same for the record. But what's important to note here is that the differences are reduced in stereotyping in the condition where participants read the article about Christianity and science being compatible. So in this condition, non-religious people actually stereotyped Christians more positively and less negatively in scientific domains. The same held true for the more subtle conjunction fallacy measure, where participants who were non-religious were more likely to say that Kevin was a PhD and a scientist if they read the article about religion and science coexisting, relative to if they read the article about religion and science being incompatible. So that was one of the first studies that was done in our lab, showing that these perceptions of conflict can be experimentally manipulated. I also did some work showing that this same manipulation of religion and science, or Christianity and science incompatibility, can actually reduce the differences between US Christians and non-Christian scientific performance, as well as reduce feelings among US Christians of stereotype threat. That is, the perception or the concern about being negatively evaluated in science due to one's religious background. So to show you a little bit about what I did in that particular study, I used the same compatibility versus incompatibility manipulation as in the previous study I showed you. And I used, again, Christian and non-Christian participants, although if I analyzed just non-religious instead of non-Christian participants, the results look exactly the same. And the outcome measures we looked at were stereotype threat. So this was a 4-item measure assessing items like, I worry that people's evaluations of my scientific ability will be affected by my religion. And for non-religious people, this was reworded to say my lack of religion. We also measured participants' performance on a scientific task, which is a task that I've used before that primarily measures analytical thinking, but it's pretty believable to tell participants that it measured their scientific reasoning capabilities. It involves reading a set of nonsense syllogisms, so that's 2 premises and a conclusion, and indicating whether the conclusion logically follows from the premises. Because anybody who knows me knows that I cannot give a talk without making some sort of cat reference, one of the example items on this task is all cats are electrified, no ghosts are electrified, therefore no ghost is a cat. Now, even though this is complete nonsense, logically this set of statements makes sense. And it was participants' job to correctly identify that along with the 14 other statements. So in this study, reading about perceptions of science and religion as compatible reduced or eliminated completely the difference between Christians and non-Christian scientific performance, as well as reduced Christians' feelings of stereotype threat in science relative to non-Christians. Whereas among those who read that religion and science were perceived as incompatible, which is the default narrative in the US, Christians underperformed relative to non-Christians, and Christians experienced substantially greater stereotype threat in science relative to non-Christians. So again, this is evidence that religion and science compatibility perceptions can be experimentally manipulated, but we have not shown this to date outside of a Western cultural context. And this was one of the goals of the present study, whether this kind of manipulation would work in a society like the UAE where conflict perceptions are less pronounced. And our main question here was whether these compatibility versus incompatibility manipulations would affect religious individuals' personal identification with and feelings of belonging in science. And so we're moving the focus from my previous studies, which looked at stereotypes and other people's perceptions and how they might affect performance, to how these narratives affect people's own perceptions of themselves. Our theoretical framework here is grounded in stereotype threat as well as social identity threat from the social psychological literature. Now, these theories have some differences, but I will discuss them together for the purposes of this presentation. And the main premise of these theories is that members of groups that are stigmatized within certain domains due to subtle environmental cues may get the sense that their identity is devalued or not particularly welcome in a particular domain in which they're negatively stereotyped. And this could lead to things like decrements in performance on relevant tasks, like I showed in the previous study, and lowered feelings of inclusion and belonging in that domain. These sorts of effects have been shown for women in STEM contexts, so science, technology, engineering, and math, who report lower sense of belonging in environments where they're surrounded by Star Trek posters and other stereotypically male things, as opposed to plants or artwork, like more neutral objects. This also has been shown with first-generation students, college students at universities and in academia, who feel a lesser sense of belonging because they have historically been underrepresented and undervalued in this context. Now, in the case of Christians, of course, or religious people in general, religious people are a majority in both the UAE and the US. So I'm not arguing here that they are a stigmatized group as a whole, but that at least in the US, they are stigmatized and negatively stereotyped within scientific domains, as my other research has shown. So in this experimental study, we recruited religious individuals from the UAE, as well as a combination of religious and non-religious individuals, all undergraduates from the US. And we focused on religious, non-religious, as opposed to Christian, non-Christian, because we wanted to keep it as similar as possible across cultural contexts. And our compatibility manipulation was instead of reading an article specific to Christianity or Islam, it was an op-ed article about religion and science more generally as schools of thought that could pertain to any religion in theory. So for our two dependent measures in this study, we assessed identification with science, which was used in the previous study that I talked about with Dr. Aveyard. And we measured sense of belonging in science with two different items. How similar do you feel to other students in science classes, and how much do you feel you belong in science classes? Our moderator was slightly different across samples. In the UAE sample, we measured religious identification with the 8-item scale. Being religious is an important part of my self-image, for example. And in the OU sample, because we had both non-religious and religious individuals, we simply used that dichotomy as our moderator, since we would have lacked the power to do a 3-way interaction with religious identification. So as I mentioned, the article that we showed participants was about science and religion more generally. And here are just some excerpts so you get a sense of what we told participants. For example, we told them in the compatibility condition that science and religion could be completely integrated, and in the incompatibility condition that they cannot be integrated together. So other statements like this were essentially near opposites of one another in both of these two article conditions. So to back up, and before I tell you about the results here, we predicted that reading about the compatibility between Christian or religion and science would minimize the differences, any potential differences we might see between religious and non-religious people's identification with and feelings of belonging in science. And that this might be true across both cultural contexts. Let's look first at the UAE sample. So this is the pattern of results that we found with identification with science as the outcome. So participants who read the compatibility article are represented with the blue line here. And you can see that the more religious participants identified as being, the more identified they were with science after reading this compatibility passage. But the opposite occurred among those who read the incompatibility passage, consistent with what our predictions. Those who identified more strongly with religion identified less strongly with science after reading that the two domains do not go together. The results on sense of belonging in science were weaker, so it's a marginally significant interaction, but in a similar pattern. And I think the results were a bit weaker because we asked about feelings of belonging in science classes, and we recognized that perhaps not all students had taken a science course yet. So that was one thing that might have affected these results. But again, in the compatibility condition, religious and scientific identification tended to be positively associated, but were negatively associated in the incompatibility condition. Now let's look here at the US sample. And we find, I'm representing on the bar graphs instead of line graphs here because of the dichotomous nature of both IVs. But here we find that among those who read the article about religion and science not going together, religious people tended to identify less with science, substantially less, than non-religious people. And this trend was reversed, but not significantly so, among those who read the compatibility article. And it's possible most of the action was in the incompatibility condition because this was the narrative that participants are most familiar with and have heard most in American society. In terms of sense of belonging in science, once again, a slightly weaker interaction, but the same pattern. Those who read the compatibility article showed no difference whether they were religious or non-religious in how much they identified with science. But among those who read the incompatibility article, religious people identified less with science than did non-religious people. So for those of you who are familiar with moderated mediation analysis, and if you're not, that's okay too, I'll just quickly explain. We wanted to see if identification with science, so participants' personal feelings of how important it was to their self-concept, would have perhaps downstream effects on their sense of belonging in scientific spaces like classrooms, and whether that varied as a function of their religiosity as well as the article they read. And we found that, in short, it did. So in the UAE sample, this effect was driven by the compatibility condition, where among people who read the compatibility article, those who were more religious identified more subsequently with science, and that in turn predicted greater feelings of belonging in science classrooms. In the OU sample, on the other hand, there was also significant mediation, but it took a slightly different pattern. Those who read the incompatibility article, if they were religious, they had lower subsequent identification with science, and then in turn, a lower sense of belonging in scientific spaces. So in other words, the pattern of the interaction was similar across cultural contexts, but in the UAE, it appeared to be driven by the compatibility condition, which was, again, probably more familiar to participants, and in the OU sample, by the incompatibility condition. Again, probably the narrative that was more familiar. So to summarize my results overall, I've shown you evidence that not only are religion and science conflict perceptions more pronounced in the US than in the UAE, but these perceptions can change and are quite malleable according to features of the cultural context. For example, the amount of time that participants spend in countries and contexts other than their own, as well as the narratives about the conflict or lack thereof between religion and science to which these students are exposed. We also found that in the UAE, but not in the US, people saw identification with religion and identification with science as being positively associated. And we showed furthermore in our experiment that these narratives about conflict versus compatibility of the two domains can affect religious people's identification with science as a domain. So some implications of this, in addition to how these cultural differences in perceptions can be quite malleable, one implication that I really wanted to highlight is that these differences in perceptions of compatibility can explain why we see religious scientists more represented in some cultural contexts, like in the UAE, than in other cultural contexts, such as North America and Western Europe. And I argue that this representation of religious individuals in sciences is extremely important to examine and to understand, because it could affect a huge chunk of students' pursuit, ultimately, of scientific careers. Given that religious people are still a majority of the world's population, if we ignore the factors that might steer religious individuals away from science, and we don't get a clear picture of what all these factors might be, we're losing out on a big population that might otherwise want to pursue science. And so I would argue participation even of majority groups in scientific spaces is critical. So to give you a sense of some current and future directions that my lab and I are working on right now, we would like to better understand what is it about cultural contexts and features of these contexts that predict differences in compatibility perceptions in the first place. Where does this all come from? There are a couple possibilities that we're entertaining right now. First of all, there are differences documented between Western and non-Western societies in what's called dialectical thinking, or tolerance for contradicting, potentially conflicting ideas and belief systems. Non-Western societies as a whole, now there's undoubtedly within or between society differences here, but as a whole, it's been shown non-Western societies generally tend to be more dialectical and more tolerant of contradiction than Western societies. And perhaps that could help explain why these conflict narratives between religion and science are more pronounced in the West. But there's also the fact that in Western societies, generally speaking, religion is seen as a relatively more communal pursuit, and science is more agentic. So religion is more focused on others and relationships with God, one's community, and so forth. And science is about working alone and being independent, at least the way it's depicted in society. But in non-Western societies, especially those that define the self in relationship to other people, science might be seen as more communal too, and is more involved with working with other people and being cooperative than it is in the West. And if this is the case, that could help explain why people don't see religion and science as conflicting as much, because both in non-Western societies might be seen as relatively more communal. And this is some work that my student Cameron Mackey and I have in progress currently. We're really excited to see the results. Finally, I want to point out that there are differences in how the conflict and compatibility narratives might be framed. So we could talk about how religion and science are seen as conflicting belief systems and schools of thought. Or alternatively, or in addition, we could talk about how being religious and being a scientist, or religious and scientific identities, are compatible versus conflicting. And I haven't really parsed out whether there are differences between these two types of narratives, but I would love to in the future, and I think there's room for a lot of research on that. But for now, I want to thank you for your time and your attention, and I'm really happy to take questions. Now I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much for this great talk, super interesting. So you can raise your hand and make questions. Does anyone has a question? Okay, we have one from Christina Moya.
Hi, Kimberly. Thank you for that talk. That was a lot of great information to take in, and I love the cross-cultural component. So I have so many questions, but one to start off is, we'll probably show off that I'm not a psychologist, I'm like an anthropologist, but has anybody actually looked at whether that cross-cultural variation in beliefs that it's compatible is actually tracking some of those metrics that you talked about at the beginning, like the proportion of scientists that are religious, right? So are these stereotypes just kind of reflecting, and this perception of compatibility just reflecting real world patterns? And then like those real world patterns would still need explaining for sure.
Yeah, so Elaine Eklund at Rice University is a sociologist who has done a lot of research looking at the percentage, I cited her in the beginning, the percentage of scientists who are religious versus non-religious and who believe religion and science are compatible versus incompatible. And I believe she has looked at some of these associations, but not necessarily like the lower level psychological mechanisms, what influences these perceptions in the first place. But her research is the best place to look for these broader cultural trends and descriptions of what's going on in populations.
Thank you.
Yeah, and you said you had a lot of questions, so I'm happy to chat more over email if you'd like.
Okay, Andrew.
Hi, that was a really interesting talk. I have a question about what people might interpret by just the general question of whether religion and science are compatible, because I mean, there's so many dimensions, right? And I think it's possible that you can find points where they're definitely not compatible and other points where they definitely are compatible. And I'm wondering if maybe some of your manipulations are shifting what people are looking at and how they're answering the question. Because I feel like you could do this with any kinds of like identities or occupations. Like you could ask, is being an athlete compatible with being a scholar? And you know, if you're focused on the dimension of time, then you might say no. But if you're focused on the dimension of other things, you might say yes. And so I'm just wondering how people go about answering that question, if it generally is from a global perspective, or you feel like actually some people are inclined to focus in on empirical claims, whereas other people are inclined to focus on values versus facts or something like that.
Yeah, and there's a lot to unpack in that question. I think it's really interesting, and that's part of why at the end I alluded to the possibility of doing more research on what is it that people think are compatible versus incompatible. Is it the belief systems? Is it the identities? Is it something else? And just as a shout out to some of my colleagues in the UK, Carola Leicht and Carissa Sharp have actually a more developed scale that they just published in the International Journal for Psychology of Religion on perceptions of religion and science compatibility. And they look at this across, I think, 20-something different domains and types of like evolution, physics, other issues. And so that would be a good place to look. And I think they find similar patterns across different domains, if I'm remembering correctly. But that said, I mean, I think these conflict and compatibility perceptions, you're right, that they probably could be manipulated in a variety of different identity contexts. So one of my students and I are actually doing research right now on people's perceptions in the US of conflict between their religious and political identities. Like say you're a political conservative, but you don't identify as religious, or you're politically liberal, but you are religious, which are identities that are seen as kind of an oxymoron in the US. What happens then with your self-concept? So yeah, I think compatibility narratives are certainly not unique to science and religion. They're probably in a lot of different places. And I would like to say too that that conflict and compatibility aren't the only possible stances that people could take on these topics. Some sociological research, including by Elaine Eklund, has instead looked at whether people see religion and science not as compatible or incompatible, but as just two independent and separate schools of thought. And within the conflict narrative, are you seeing them as in conflict and you think science is superior, or do you think religion is superior? So there's a lot of nuance, I think, that could be captured by looking at these narratives beyond just conflict and compatibility. So thanks for raising those issues. I think they're all really important.
Oh, those are great points. Thanks.
Okay, Flo.
Thank you, Kim, for a very interesting talk. I have similar curiosities as Andrew, just really looking at like what about these things, right? That make them, think about what aspects are more about. So that led me to wonder what makes these beliefs malleable. It seems like the interventions have worked, right, in some way to at least shift them to some degree. Like that, the older study that you, not that old, that you cited, a prior study about Francis Collins and all that. What about that? Because I'm not familiar with the study. What about that intervention you think was exposing people to what's possible? And is there more that we can kind of look into there for learning more about where these beliefs comes from and what could be done to see how they might shift?
Yeah, so in that particular Dawkins versus Collins study, the description that participants got of either of those scientists was very minimal. It was basically just saying, Dawkins is an outspoken atheist who's an evolutionary biologist versus Collins is the director of the NIH and is a Christian. And so my sense, even though this wasn't tested, of what might have been going on was that participants were exposed to potential role models or exemplars of a religious scientist versus a non-religious scientist. There's a lot of social psych research on how women in STEM disciplines who are exposed to female role models who have been successful, that can be really motivating and increase belonging. And I would think that that was at least part of what might have been going on in that Dawkins and Collins study. And actually, my student Cameron and I are getting ready, and a study will run pretty soon to test that very same question. So thanks.
So yeah, great. So it's not so much like they're learning about the beliefs themselves that could reconcile any, like coexistence style, like, oh, this is possible because it's, that's how they fit. Some, not like.
I mean, at least in that study, because there was no real information about their beliefs other than this person's a scientist and a Christian versus this person's a scientist and an atheist. But I do think that in other contexts, the information about beliefs can be really important. Carissa.
Oh, sorry. But Flo, I was just going to follow up on that because in the study that we ran cross-culturally, there was a little bit more description in terms of why there's compatibility or incompatibility. And I was trying to find the full text here and I'm not finding it. But I'll send that to you at some point and you can see if there's something in there that you think is particularly driving these effects. These are not huge effect sizes that we're finding. And, part of the point right from the start was kind of maybe hit them with multiple ideas that are kind of interrelated, but not to unpack things maybe at the level of detail that would make it a little more interesting just because we haven't, tried the manipulation before. But.
Okay, Carissa.
Thanks, Kim. Fantastic work as always. I was just really curious. This might be a bit of a pedantic question, so we could also chat about this later. But I'm just interested in what primes work and what primes don't work. So like I think it's really interesting that you said that your primes, it seemed to be the arguments that people were familiar with that they were affected by, but then in Elaine Eklund's paper with Collins versus Dawkins, the argument for why the Dawkins or why the Collins biography kind of affected people's attitudes while the Dawkins one didn't, is that it was a kind of unusual argument that people might not be as aware of. So I was just curious what you think, whether it's affects people more, whether it's a familiar argument or a non-familiar argument.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it probably depends on the outcome. And I know that's a default social psych explanation, everything depends on everything. But yeah, I think with, on one hand, seeing something that's surprising and sort of counter stereotypical might affect people more. But on the other hand, if it's framed in such a way that it's not seen as very believable, then it might lead to reactance or just have no effect. So yeah, probably again, is a lot about the context and how these arguments are presented.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Bruce.
Thank you for the talk, which I just got a great deal from, and actually will give me something to think about in the field very shortly. So what I was concerned with in the way the studies were set up and the way the questions were set up is whether the category of religion, maybe also science, were aggregated too much, in the sense that relationship between science, for example, if we just look at people who will identify their religious practices or beliefs or identity, notice there are three things there, as Christian, it strikes me that there's a great deal of difference between somebody who's a practicing Roman Catholic like Francis Collins and somebody who, I want to go to the other extreme, who basically treats being Christian as an identity category. And I wonder if these can all be teased out and may in fact produce very different results. So my first blush kind of suggestion is that it's possible that Catholics will end up looking more like Muslims in the UAE than will, and that people who identify themselves as Christians as an identity category, not at all a religious category, turn out to, who are basically secular but say we're Christians, end up on the other extreme. So this may in fact not involve a conflict of beliefs per se, not even necessarily a conflict of institutions, but might end up aggregating a whole bunch of different sorts of vectors. And I wonder if you could talk to that and how that might play out in your work in the future.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that. I think that's a critical question, and it's actually one that I'm working on right now. So I did, first of all, want to point you to the research of one of my colleagues, Adam Cohen, who's at Arizona State. And he does a lot of research on how religions are sort of microcultures, and some of them, broadly speaking, like Protestantism, are rooted more in personal beliefs, and others, broadly speaking, like Judaism and even Catholicism, more in practices and or identity. Right. And so he and I, along with Dr. Aveyard here, we're collaborating right now on a new way of conceptualizing religious identity to incorporate all of these dimensions, so that when we assess religiosity in these types of studies, we can do it not just by saying, how religious are you? How important is your religion to you? But by capturing some of this nuance. And I do think that there's a lot of stuff at play, like in some religions where one's group identity or practices are more important than one's personal beliefs, then you'll see really different effects on conflict versus compatibility. We haven't tested that yet, but we're hoping to get the money to do so soon. And if we don't, we're hoping to do some of it anyway. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that there are no more questions, and we are, a little over the time.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And if you have questions that come to mind, feel free. My email is just rios@ohio.edu. Super easy. So you know where to find me.